The MoonSwatch arrived, and we all really wanted to learn more. It was exciting, it was strange, head-scratching. Safe to say that it is one of, if not the most controversial watch releases in recent years. But you know what, it's also one of the most successful watch releases in recent years. Two giants in the industry coming together to create an amalgamation of sorts, a watch that anyone could own, a speedmaster for the masses. It does have quite a poetic story around it. And when I made the last video around this subject, it was about 2 months ago when the world hadn't necessarily had these watches in hand. We hadn't even heard about the stores opening up for these releases. We all know what happened after the fact. Queues forming for miles and miles all over the world in all of the major cities. To an extent that these Swatch boutiques said you could only get 2 watches on release, then it whittled down to 1. To say that the state of the MoonSwatch's release was manic is an understatement, and most of us know what has happened since then. So this video I want to expand on the subject of discussing Omega as a brand, Swatch as a brand, how it affects these manufacturers, as well as looking at the overarching cultural effect of what a watch like this does, looking at the grey market flipping, and all the controversies that surround the MoonSwatch and its launch. Before we get into this video, on the wrist today is not an Omega. The perfect time to be talking about an Omega is to wear one, but I'm wearing a Seiko for a good reason. I did this deliberately. I'm talking about a watch that costs roughly $300. So to counter that, with a Seiko 5, this watch cost me all of £100. That's $130 US. And what are you getting for your money here? Full steel construction, automatic movement with a day-date complication, the best lume in the industry. The Seiko 5 is an absolute icon. And it needs to be said that the watch that I'm wearing on my wrist today costs half the price of what a MoonSwatch does. The opener for a subject like this, which I think is appropriate, is asking the question, why are people going crazy for this watch? What was it that fueled the interest and the intrigue from day one? What caused these queues to form? The best thing we could liken a release like this to is an Apple product launch, where people spend hours and days camped outside stores. Now, we have heard of similar times when Swatch collaboration releases received this kind of fanfare. The Hodinkee System 51 collaboration, I think, is one such example. All power to them. The technology that goes into producing a fully automatic watch like that is pretty amazing. But this Omega Swatch collaboration caused absolute pandemonium. I could not believe what I was seeing on social media when this was happening. Now, maybe this mass hysteria began because of that herd mentality, for lack of a better word. They saw what everyone else was doing and thought they needed to jump in line too. But that still doesn't answer the fundamental question of why did everyone want this watch in the first place? Was it because they could finally get an affordable Omega? Was this a small audience of people who didn't in fact own an Omega and this was their first chance? If that was the case, I would understand fully, but that wasn't the entire turnout. Was this craze perpetuated by word of mouth, by advertising, by people like me who hype up the interest of a watch like this? Or was it a large majority of people who saw a watch like this and thought it was a great opportunity to get some more money in their back pocket, buying them and then selling them on the grey market for whatever the price? I've actually answered this question with these summarized points. Whether enthusiast, new time buyer, or flipper, they all joined this group en masse and tried to get one. But I think this next point is far more relevant, and that's talking about the brand name, the name of Omega and Swatch, and how they work together. No other recent release has stirred up as much controversy as this one has. One side wants Omega as a brand to flourish and to be noticed as a luxury brand. It went so far that a lot of people actually deliberately asked for their names to be taken off lists for watches because of this collaboration. The other side of the spectrum, we see those who look at the MoonSwatch as an affordable, fun option that anybody can enjoy. And then in the middle, we see someone who views both sides, who appreciates the exclusivity of an Omega brand, but who also doesn't mind the idea of having a cheaper alternative. I think it's very important to cover the context around the Swatch group. Omega is owned by Swatch. What Swatch says, Omega has to comply. And I believe there was talk that Omega was actually very reluctant to go through with this idea. They weren't for the option. And in fact, if we look at the MoonSwatch, the first name on the front of it says Omega. Omega is far bolder than Swatch. So does a launch, collaboration, whatever you want to call it, like this, do justice to a brand like Omega? We have to jump back in time and look at how the brand was perceived through the ages. The 1940s, 50s, and 60s, Omega created amazing watches. Everything from original designs to amazing workhorse movements. It's safe to say that they had a very strong reputation. The 1970s arrive and we hit a wall. The quartz crisis, the quartz quandary. Brands have to try and do whatever they can to survive, and of course, many have to adopt quartz for their choice of movement. You see how designs changed drastically, and Omega as a brand, they didn't necessarily focus solely on making quartz movements, they still made mechanical components, but quartz definitely took up a large part of their sales. A bit of buying and selling happened between then, and we look at Omega in the 1990s, and they created a landslide with watches like the Seamaster Professional, bearing in mind that those watches also debuted in quartz, and this was the early 90s. James Bond provenance, all that fanfare, all the while we still had the mechanical Moonwatch front and center. And you look at Omega today, they are creating some of the best watch movements that money can buy you today. Just absolute powerhouses, constantly pushing the technology further forward. They were one of the first to overemphasize the anti-magnetic properties of their movement. The Daniels coaxial escapement, now tried and true, produces such amazing accuracy. And let's not forget that Omega was one of the first to cover their watches with META certification. It has virtually marginalized quartz movements from their core product line, only featuring them in ladies' watches, and have doubled down on pioneering technologies that have made their movements some of the best in the world. And it's gotten to a point now where modern Omega is now well and truly known for its watchmaking. So with a launch like this, a Quartz Speedmaster, yes, this is not a part of Omega's catalog, but it does have Omega's name tied to it. You are once again reverting back to quartz technology. And in a way, there's this oxymoronic throwback now where we're looking at a watch that definitely would belong in the 1970s if the world had gone differently. This is something I've been thinking about a lot, especially when Omega brings out a 3861 coaxial Speedmaster a year before. It is understandable then that Omega was reluctant with a launch like this. But then again, we move away from the purist side, we move away from the enthusiasm and talk about how brilliant of a marketing and business strategy it was. Because people are adopting this watch and wearing it as a fun, accessible option. It can be seen as a more mechanical take on how the G-Shock is interpreted today. In a similar vein to how you're seeing the Nautilus and the Royal Oaks and all of these stainless steel sports watches on the wrist of celebrities, you're now seeing the MoonSwatch being worn as this countercultural status symbol. Somehow, someway, it's adopted this moniker of high fashion. What does a release like this do? Well, it communicates to a lot more people about the design, about the brand, about this collaboration. I think it's safe to say, hopefully, that a watch like this has brought a lot more people into this hobby. We all just hope that it's the right group of people and not the flexing culture, if you know what I mean. Let's get down to brass tacks though. Quality versus value for money. I have to emphasize this point more. I am an industrial designer. A lot of what I've done in the past is to create items that are essentially built to be disposed of. It's an awful, awful thing. I hate the fact that products are built to be thrown away. And whether you like it or not, whether you deny it or not, we as human beings treat plastic very differently to other materials. And the MoonSwatch, if we bypass all the technological talk linked to the bioceramic case and the technology that's gone into manufacturing it, it is still essentially a plastic case that houses a quartz movement. I've heard from multiple accounts that this watch has a very cheap, airy, light feel. And let's not get into talking about how the dye from these cases actually leak onto the skin. How it seems that sweat and moisture seems to affect the first layer of this dye on the case. You know, none of these points screams luxury. And maybe it shouldn't. But I believe for a price that you're paying for a watch like this, there does need to be some further level of investigation. Right, let's talk about the grey market experience, because if you want to talk about controversy, if you go onto eBay right now and you type in Omega, odds are you will be flooded by MoonSwatch listings. And these numbers go anywhere from £350 to £1,000, maybe even more. There is a certain individual out there who set history by buying one of these watches for £8,000. All these months later, even still, people are losing their minds about owning one of these watches. And I still, for the life of me, cannot fathom the reason why. Now, this is the thing that factors into this grey market space, is that Swatch hasn't mentioned that their watches are going to be available online anytime soon, that they're only still available at select stores. And of course, naturally, buying at these stores is still difficult. The question I have to ask is, why is the brand doing this? Because of course this is feeding into the demand versus supply issue. There's too much demand, there's not enough product, so of course this allows the grey market to inflate their prices to whatever amount they feel like. And if we are to circle back to the beginning of this video, the Swatch watch being a Swiss watch for all, the idea that a release like this would allow anyone to own the Moonwatch, that it's a watch for the masses. But now, after all the mania, there still seems to be this air of forced exclusivity with a product like this. How does this translate into Swatch's message? The final thing I want to cover is talking about the future of this launch and what a release like this does for watches. Does this give manufacturers more confidence to create cheaper products that anyone would go after? Does this mean that the future of collaborations is bright and that we're going to see many more of these? I did in many ways feel very happy that a Speedmaster like this was democratized for people to own. That was before we started seeing queues forming and grey market inflation happening, and now these watches being restricted that people can't own, and the hype is still around and people are still talking about them. Even though I am someone who is firmly against disposability and manufacture purely for obsolescence, I'd much prefer my watches being mechanical and lasting a very long time, personally. The fact that these watches have now moved into that exclusive bubble, where at the moment they aren't seen as fun and accessible and available for all, but has been manipulated and transformed into something that belongs in a different niche. Not necessarily one I believe belongs there. You know, the case of the MoonSwatch in a nutshell is still ongoing. It's still odd and perplexing. It's one that I can't wrap my head around. That people are milking them for all they're worth and are succeeding in doing so really bugs me. And the honest answer is that there is no knowing where the future of a launch like this will go. Will this trickle down into other areas, affect other groups? This was most definitely not a lightning in a bottle moment and could easily be replicated. But the question is, how far are brands willing to go? Will this allow for new people to join in the hobby and to appreciate the wonder of watches? Or will it continue to be a money-making exercise from multiple fronts? I'll leave that one up to you. I honestly don't know how I feel about this watch and about the launch. A few months ago, I was excited. I was enthusiastic because it was something we'd never seen before. Because it was allowing this idea of an accessible Speedmaster for everyone. Now we're at a stage where these watches aren't available, where they are still being overhyped, hyped up on the grey market, going for ridiculous prices, and it seems to have backfired in quite a lot of ways. I don't think Swatch or Omega knew that this was going to be such a success, the way you want to see it, such a success that it is now. And it was seriously overwhelming for Swatch to try and get through. The long and short of it at the end of the day, people, is to be smart with your money, be wise, don't feed into this trap if that's where it's going. All I can say is that this hobby is weird, and the nuances are even weirder.